Our second guest is Cynthia Isenhour, professor of anthropology and climate change at the University of Maine. Eisenhower currently completed a 5-year National Science Foundation supported project focused on Maine's culture of thrift and its contemporary relevance for economic and climate resilience.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Michael, for your important work. That was great. And I hope to circle back to the point on financialization, which I think is really spot on and really important to think about for the future of Maine's economies. So today I want to have a bit of a provocation, asking us to reimagine what wealth and what work might look like in the future. So I'm not a historian, but I'm going to take a look back at the past in order to think about, as we approach a future where it's likely that we're going to reach the end of cheap nature, right? This is a broad brush, but in climatic change and in resource depletion, how might we reimagine wealth and work in ways that might benefit Maine people? So I'll start here by thinking about how we construct the problem, right? Anytime we're thinking about a future, we are thinking about what's the problem. And I'll start here building off the theme of this year's Historians Forum with a poem by Sharon Bray, Shutting Down Paper Machines. Mill still hums, but we all know next week 500 families will tighten their trousers, put guns, camps, four-wheelers up for sale, cancel winter vacation plans. The work of the Bucksport paper machines used to show up on every page of Life magazine, made from trees cut with chainsaws, hauled in from Road 9 on the airline, put through drum barkers, clanked along overhead conveyors, into steam and noise of the woodroom where shifts of union men wore ear protectors. Workers jostled for places on the Sunday list, double time, better than church. Train cars brought in chemicals, carried out white clay-coated rolls of paper. Silence and darkness come on. They sold our mill for scrap metal. So the first part of the problem that I want to highlight here has to do with this idea of economic depletion, where we have real concerns here in Maine about the future of work, which is tied to this post-industrial transition and the decline of traditional industry that Michael pointed out, the loss of key productive sectors for the state, and particularly the loss of skilled wage jobs. And we get concerns about cyclical unemployment associated with some of these shutdowns. And these are ultimately tied to, well-documented booms and busts in capitalist systems, but that have real implications for local communities, and this idea of kind of geographic economic abandonment, where we get periods of bust and boom. The reason I'm bringing this up is partially because when I moved to Maine about 10 years ago, I stumbled onto some literature which talked about, in the wake of some of these mills closing down, this concept of depleted communities. And I thought that rhetorically was a really interesting way to frame the problem. And so let me just give you a quote here. Depleted communities are defined as communities that have lost much of their economic rationale as a space, but they retain really high attachments and social relations of place. So I was really kind of intrigued by that idea. And it dawned on me as an economic anthropologist that oftentimes when we put things in deficit framing, like depletion, that oftentimes we're missing other forms of value that exist in places. So that's the first part of the problem. The second part of the problem is linked to this idea of unsustainable economic systems that we largely now recognize in the scientific community and in the broader public sphere for many, that we have highly unsustainable economic systems. And we can think about that in lots of different ways. One frame to think about it is in terms of just global materials use, which has grown by a factor of 8 over the last century. And a lot of people would say, oh, well, that's a factor of population, but it's outpacing population growth significantly. So we're using much more than we used to. We also know that with climatic change, that about 50% of all greenhouse gases, so if you can cut the emissions pie many different ways, but about 50% of all greenhouse gases are linked to our materials use. So this throughput of extraction, production, consumption, disposal, and waste. And nearly 75% of municipal waste is generated by discarded consumer goods. So the things that we buy and unfortunately throw them away, typically, about 90% of things within 6 months of their sale. So we have this very unsustainable take-make waste model of an economy, and that's not unique to Maine, of course. That's kind of defines mass consumer society today. So without making it sound like a silver bullet, when I started this project, I really was looking at these two problems, right? These problems of economic boom and bust and economic abandonment in some geographies, but then also this highly unsustainable economic system. And I was reading a lot in the literature about, mostly by proponents of reuse and repair, who were arguing that by investing in patterns of redistribution, reuse, and repair, that might have the potential to address some of these problems. So, and here's essentially the outline of my presentation, is that it would have the potential to generate culturally resonant forms of economic development, create more circular, less wasteful, and efficient economic systems, improve community level social capital and resilience, and create jobs and skills that can help us to steward our materials. I'm going to have to rush through some of these, unfortunately, but I do invite folks to reach out to me if you want to hear more about any one of these points. I'm going to really focus on the first point and the fourth point, given the topic of the Historians Forum this year. So before I start, just a little bit of background. So I started this 5-year NSF study on Maine's culture of reuse in response to a lot of the literature that kind of presented reuse and repair as a potentially grand solution. I'm not sure it's that, but just to be clear, when we talk about reuse, we're talking about the redistribution of previously owned material goods in their original form. So this is not recycling, where you're taking a material and making it into something new. It's not repurposing, where you're taking an old tire and making it into a planter. This is a good redistributed in its original form. And part of the reason that we're talking about it in that way is because these are traded, right? Sometimes monetarily, sometimes not. But also because there's very little additional energy or materials input like there is with recycling that kind of gives it some more environmental benefit. So this was a 5-year study that I completed in 2022, and it was designed to explore the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of reuse economies. It included a wide suite of different methodologies, including national level economic and spatial analysis of reuse markets and employment, also state level surveys of both reuse establishments as well as households. We did economic contribution analyses and some pretty in-depth community level ethnographic case studies. And I just wanted to quickly point out before I move on to some of the results that this is the product of a lot of folks that participated, and I'm grateful to all of them for their input. We had several faculty as well as 4 graduate students and 11 undergrads participate. So lots of people to thank there. Okay, so the first finding goes to my first point for the presentation about the hidden economic value of reuse economies and their potential for culturally resonant development. So one of the first findings kind of came in the study design when we were trying to think about, okay, how do we measure the economic contribution of reuse economies? And one thing that we found is that, when we think about measuring economic output, or where does economic value come from, how's it generated, is that we have a very strong international cultural framing of economic value as being generated by production. And so that's oftentimes why we tie our economic wealth and well-being to industry, right? So, but what we noticed though is that once, when we're thinking about reuse and things that, have already been produced, we can look at how they're actually calculated in GDP. So if we think about someone buying something, in this case, let's say a monitor or a TV, they put money into it and then it goes into the national economy. But at the end of the 3 months, in terms of how we calculate GDP, there's actually no value left in that television or monitor. But is that really true? So what we found is that, if we think about how we measure the value of reuse economies, our industrial categorizations don't easily capture reuse. They don't capture a lot of the transactions that happen after this initial sale. They also don't capture a lot of the informal sector distributions that happen. And part of the reason for that is just that there are a lot of forms of value that aren't really easily measured or quantified. But what we knew from doing some of our early work is that Maine's reuse economy is consistently strong. So over time, I'm just showing you one graph here, but we did a national level analysis of reuse sectors across the United States, looking at factors like employment, at location quotients of number of establishments, so what percentage of businesses are in the reuse sector. And what we found is that Maine is consistently in the top 10, and maybe even more interesting is that Maine's reuse sector is consistently strong regardless of what's happening with the first order markets. So that regardless of what's happening in the economy overall in the United States, if we're in a period of boom or bust, we see that Maine's reuse economy is consistently strong, which I think is really interesting in thinking about, what's the potential for culturally resonant development here in Maine. So we knew that a persistent and enduring culture of thrift wasn't new in Maine, and we assumed there was a history there. So this is important because a large body of literature suggests that development programs and environmental policies tend to be much more successful when they're implemented in ways that are consistent with local culture. So once we found evidence to support our hunch that Maine had a particularly vibrant reuse economy, we dug into some of the historical literature and looked in memoirs, old magazines, historical newspapers, and oftentimes found evidence of Maine's strong history of reuse in unexpected places. The statement you see here on this slide says confidently by the self-proclaimed first antiques dealer in Maine, Fred Bishop Tuck, that there's an old adage in the world of antiques that New England is the attic of America, and that in turn, Maine is the attic of New England. We learned from Tuck's memoirs that he set up shop in Kennebunkport in the late 19th century, and over time constructed images of Maine that suggested a differentiation between the most northeasterly state and other places customers might purchase their wares. An antiquarian, Edwin Mitchell, in 1939 wrote in his book, Maine Summer, "It is a suggestion, the stirring of the imagination that makes visiting antique shops worthwhile, and there is, of course, always the chance of finding some treasure." In other Depression-era texts, the proverb, "use it up, wear it out, make do or do without," emerged as an ethos of thrift commonly associated with New England. And many historical sources and ethnographies identified Maine culture as one of independence, ingenuity, thriftiness, and taciturnity. Historian Mimi Killinger noted that back to the landers, Helen and Scott Nearing's lifestyle was extraordinarily austere, frugal, and out-Yankeeing the Yankee existence. Suggestions of this longstanding culture of austerity are still apparent in Maine. Mainer and self-described frugal zealot, Amy DeSazen, began promoting thrift as a viable alternative lifestyle in a widely popular newsletter, the Tightwad Gazette, in the 1990s, which was later published as a book. She encouraged parsimony, stating, for example, it takes 5 seconds to clean a used piece of aluminum foil. She provided tips for giving better gifts. She said, excuse me, under certain circumstances, giving used gifts can be appropriate, usually when you're giving to another tightwad who knows and appreciates the values of used items. And she compiled a regular what to do with column that presented readers with advice on how to reuse everything from plastic grocery bags to unflattering photographs to old refrigerator gaskets. Today, it's difficult to miss the many markers of a robust reuse economy. Yard sale signs are abundant from early spring until the snow begins in fall. Even in the middle of winter, stacks of swap it or sell it guides sit near cash registers and local shops along I-95, and reuse affinity groups abound online to facilitate second-hand sales, such as the Mama Swap of Maine or the Maine Buy Swap Sell, whose tagline once stated, "Got clutter? Don't wait until yard sale season." The popular treasure hunting program American Pickers filmed several episodes in Maine, and an entire reality TV show, Downey's Dickering, spent 2 seasons focused on bargain hunters in Maine and their use of swap and sell it guides as a way to live on their own terms. So in thinking about some of this historical precedent and the kind of cultural resonance of reuse economies in Maine that have really deep historical roots, we wanted to understand some of this hidden economic value that isn't easily calculated by our economic indicators. So just for example, here in the state of Maine, we did a household survey where we asked people, these are self-reported, but to recall how much they had spent on reuse and repair over the previous year. And we got an average of over $1,000 per household, which would add up to about 570 million per year in Maine. That doesn't include any sort of multiplier effect. In terms of repair, we got an average of 280 a year, which would be about 156 million per year in Maine. We did multiply that. Our data was a little better for multiplication and got about 240 million in economic output and 89 million in labor income. So if we add those together, we are very conservatively getting about 726 million per year in Maine. The interesting thing though is that it's, if we think about the size of this, can we call it an industry, this economic activity, it parallels some of the other activities that our state and our communities invest heavily in, but yet this hidden economic sector gets almost no policy support. So in making this provocation, I want to encourage us to think about where does economic value come from? And while kind of Western capitalist societies have long focused on the value of production and industry to build wealth, I want to help us think about in a future of ecological precarity, how we might come to associate stronger value with redistribution economies. So I draw really heavily on James Ferguson, who talks a lot about the idea of distributive labor, which is largely hidden and unaccounted for, but seeks to transfer resources from those who have them to those who don't. It's, he says, a necessary and valuable social function, but it should be recognized, named, and valued as such, which it currently isn't. And the argument here is that distributive labor is a means to build wealth in people and to redistribute goods that still have value, which then can offset all of the energy, emissions, materials, and waste that would be associated with a parallel new project. Okay, so moving on to the second point, I'm just going to slide through this one really quickly because I am going to run out of time. But there's a whole body of literature out there which suggests, based on life cycle analyses, that reuse can save us a lot. And that's in terms of water use, emissions, pollution in general, so toxicity. With very few exceptions. There are a few exceptions, which I'd be happy to answer in questions. But what we found is that here in Maine, we do have a strong reuse sector, a very vibrant reuse economy. And when we surveyed reuse organizations, we found that 60% of them cited environmental concerns as their reason for starting their business or working in the nonprofit sector. And when we surveyed households, waste prevention showed up as one of the primary motivators for both offering used goods and getting used goods. So it's really culturally resonant. And thinking about in terms of what that can do, here's just a really modest indicator is that, if we know that 75% of municipal solid waste is discarded consumer goods and about 25% of that is still usable, we can think about that in terms of about 200,000 tons of waste diverted in Maine through reuse, potentially. And that would save us, if we take the average tipping fee across the state, that's $16 million in tipping fees avoided alone. So I'll leave this idea of a more circular, more efficient economy aside for now, because I want to talk a little bit also about the potential for reuse to build community social capital and resilience. I had an incredible graduate student on this project who volunteered her time for over a year in thrift stores and was able to really track some of the community social capital that can be built, as well as forms of resilience in reuse markets. And one of the things she found is, of course, just to underline what I've already said, is that we value what we measure. And oftentimes the sociality built through these reuse networks is really difficult. So her ethnographic fieldwork really allowed her to understand that. And what we realized through this and through over 150 different interviews was that sociality was mentioned over and over in terms of building community, in terms of creating trust between people, helping others out, and generating opportunities for civic engagement. But that's not to say that it's all good. I'll get back to the point about financialization, but there is the very real reality that a lot of these reuse markets are animated by volunteer labor and oftentimes by elderly retirees, and that's certainly not sustainable either. So I wanted to show you just as a quick illustration of some of the community level resilience, just a quick case study of two small towns. These are pseudonyms for the towns, but they actually are real Maine towns, where we can see a kind of a reuse network map. The circle in the middle is Kaylee, who was just one participant, but you can see how entwined she is in this network. And what we can do is we can look at kind of narrow that down to see exactly where she's participating. And I just want you to make note that she's connected into lots of different nodes. She's getting and receiving things from a local nonprofit thrift shop, and she also redistributes things to her networks of friends. She sells some items at local sales and donates textiles to a local provider. Through her participation in reuse, Kaylee is connected to a larger community. We can also see that sometimes she will sell directly to national level platforms like eBay, and that's a terminating node. But I'll just go back to the last slide where you can see that there's all sorts of potential value being realized through Kaylee's redistributive labor. Okay. And just very quickly, I wanted to just point out that when we looked at these community case studies, we were looking at several different nonprofits that were operating in both communities, and their mission, of course, is to serve the community. So we found that between 4 different nonprofits, there was $148,000 generated annually. And these supported things like homelessness, domestic abuse, community improvement, literacy, and hunger relief. And just worth it to note that this money is about equivalent to the town's annual parks and recreation budget. But once again, absolutely no investment in this reuse economy. Okay, and then finally, and I'm almost out of time here, got 1 more minute, I'll go fast, is that one thing that we learned is that a lot of the motivation for getting involved in Maine's reuse economy was it provided a form of flexible labor. So rather than wage-based jobs, which didn't allow for care work, for family, for friends, participation in reuse sectors really gave people the flexibility to participate with a low capital requirements for startup, and in ways that kind of suited the realities of their everyday life. We found in many cases, I think we heard 8 different stories of people that started reuse businesses after they were laid off from a mill, which is not a huge N, but really powerful kind of anecdotal evidence. So starting participation in reuse as a form of resilience against economic precarity, but that wasn't it. We also heard lots of stories about how it brings people joy to find things, to save things from landfill, and to ensure that pieces of history have a life moving forward. So to leave you today, I just wanted to point out that while it might seem a bit far-fetched to say that stronger reuse networks could address such big problems as, economic booms and busts, or the ecological problems we're facing, I did just want to point out that there is really strong international policy momentum for reuse and repair. We see this at the international level with lots of different gray literature, policy briefs coming out of organizations like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and Circle Economy. But we're also seeing it at state and even national levels. So Oregon, for example, has put together an entire strategic plan for reuse, repair, and extension of lifespan. And part of that plan has an entire chapter on building jobs, good jobs around reskilling people for reuse and repair. And we also see some reports have been put out by the International Labor Organization about educating for more circular economic jobs. And in the European Commission, we have, as part of their new circular economy action plan, a significant portion of that dedicated to reuse, employment, and distributive labor. I was going to give 2 quick case studies, but I'm sorry I've gone over time, so I'm going to stop here. But 2 great examples that I'm happy to talk more about later is Sweden's tax break for people who are repairing as an employment strategy, partially, and then also in Oregon, their reuse and repair grant recipients, which has really focused in once again on the creation of jobs. Okay, thanks everybody, and I will stop there.